Hey there, and welcome to a brand new video on how to diagram periods and how to diagnose period structure in music altogether. This is, of course, based on chapter 15 of Stephen Laitz's The Complete Musician. And we're going to get started with a little bit of physics. Question about, is it really true that what goes up must come down? Welcome to Period Structure and Phrase Diagrams by your host, Professor of Music at the University of New Mexico, David Michael Bashwiner.
What goes up must come down, must come down, down, down.
That's right.
What goes up must come down, must come down, down.
I know it's true, actually, because of this song. So let's see what we're going to learn about physics today. If you throw a ball in the air, like you might see on the right, as you release it, it has its highest kinetic energy. In other words, its most amount of movement, but its lowest potential energy. At its peak, as it peaks, at the top, it has its highest potential energy, but its lowest kinetic energy. So it actually pauses there, in a sense. And then when you catch it, once, it's in your hand and it stops, then its kinetic energy, of course, is low, and so its potential energy, it's at least lower than it is at the top. You could say its tensions are resolved. The kinetic and potential energy are lower than they were at previous points. So, red arrow for tension, blue arrow for relief of tension. By the way, this may be obvious, but really you'd be throwing the ball up and it would be coming straight down, but it's separate here. Hope you can deal with that. So, why are we talking about physics? Well, let's talk about music for a second and see if we can see comparison. So, cadences, we'd like to compare cadences and potential energy. So, I'm going to make some assumptions here. One, a cadence is a kind of pause in musical flow. We know that up to this point we've defined cadence as something that ends a phrase. A phrase is something that ends a cadence. That's a definition for cadence that is syntactic in a way. It's grammatical in the same way that you would say a sentence has a noun clause and a verb clause. But there is the more general way in which you might just say a cadence would be a pause, and we can at least start there. So that pause can correspond, at least metaphorically, to the ceasing of kinetic energy. When you throw a ball up in the air, you throw the ball up and it moves fast at first and it slows until it gets to the top, and then there's a kind of pause there. And if it were going straight up, you would see it just come back down this way again, but there would be a pause at a point where it's obvious it's not moving, but it still has some energy, right? And that's called potential energy. So we can think of these things harmonically. The degree of harmonic tension at the moment of the pause can be either high, if you're pausing on a 5 chord, or it can be low if you're pausing on a 1 chord. So we're just imagining up here that this is a 5 and that's a 1, and therefore the ball can pause here, it can pause here, you can pause on 5, you can pause on 1. We know that's our half cadence, and that's our authentic cadence. And we're going to say that the half cadence is higher tension, the authentic cadence is resolution of tension. And then finally, the degree of melodic tension may also be higher or lower, so melody, not harmony, depending on whether the melody resolves to scale degree 1 or whether it resolves to some other scale degree on the 1 chord, like scale degree 5. Here I did 1 or 3, so 1 would be perfect authentic cadence, 3 is imperfect authentic. You can sometimes do scale degree 5, but 3 is the most common scale degree for an imperfect authentic cadence. Hey, there you go. Okay, let's explore single phrases in this whirl of physics. Half cadence, a phrase that starts on 1, which we're putting at the bottom, and ends on 5, which we're putting at the top, a point of high tension. That's why it's in red. And I say somewhere other than 1. So meaning that then it wouldn't be a half cadence, but if you start on 1 and you move to, you do an authentic cadence in some other key, on 2, on 3, on 5, on 6, as long as you're moving somewhere away from 1 and pausing there, we're going to consider that it to look like this in our kind of physics diagram. we might, just instead of writing half cadence, we might write AC in 2, authentic cadence in 2, or authentic cadence in 6 or something. Okay. Now we have phrases that start on 1 and end on 1. So starting down here, ending again down here at the 1 area, but kind of imperfectly. The melody only resolved to scale degree 3. So what I have at the top here, phrases that start on 1, end on 1, with melodies ending either imperfectly or perfectly. Those are both authentic cadences, but those are both individual phrases. And lastly, we have a possibility of a phrase that starts on 5 or just starts somewhere other than 1 and then ends on 1. And then that's still going to be authentic cadence. Maybe it ends on scale degree 1, maybe it ends on scale degree 3 in the melody. So these are going to be our 4 types of individual phrases. I don't think you necessarily need to memorize these as 4 types of phrases, but for diagnosing period structure, these are the 4 things we're thinking about. A phrase that ends in a half cadence, starts on 1, ends in a half cadence. A phrase that starts on 1, ends in an imperfect authentic cadence, phrase that starts on 1 and ends in a perfect authentic cadence, and then one that starts not on 1 but ends in some sort of authentic cadence. Okay. Warning. What makes phrases go together has nothing to do with their melodic content, at least in theory. So like if one melody was played on the nose flute, and another melody was played by someone just making fart sounds. Sorry, am I going to get fired for this? We'll see. As long as there's a weaker cadence at the end of the first melody that's played by the nose flute, those phrases would technically still go together, assuming they have completely different melodic content. Realistically, you probably do want to pay attention a little bit, but they don't have to have the similar melodic content to go together. That's the important idea. All that matters is whether the first cadence, the cadence at the end of the first phrase, is weaker than the second. And how do we know what's weaker? We don't really have to feel it out. We just label them. If it's a half cadence, it's weaker than either of the 2 authentic cadences. If it's imperfect authentic, that's stronger than half cadence, but weaker than perfect authentic. And perfect authentic is the strongest of all cadences. And everything else is not a cadence. So if we had deceptive cadence, that's not a cadence. If we have evaded cadence, not a cadence. Those things matter. They're musically interesting, but we just don't consider them in terms of period structure because they don't count as cadences. So there's going to be 4 possible combinations of phrases that form periods: interrupted, continuous, sectional, progressive. Now, I know you're probably thinking hey, if there's 4 different types of phrases and that below the yellow box, and you combine those in various different ways, shouldn't there be 16 or something like that? No, because not all of them would form periods. So you couldn't do 2 phrases that end on half cadences, one after the other, because the second phrase wouldn't be stronger than the half cadence, right? They wouldn't go. You could do 2 phrases that follow like that, one ending on a half cadence, another one ending on a half cadence, but they wouldn't form a period. So we're specifically looking at how phrases combine together to form periods in these ways, based on this grammatical rule that a period is defined as one phrase ending in a weaker cadence and the next phrase ending in a stronger cadence. That's the one rule. And then the other rule that by definition half cadence is weaker than imperfect authentic, and imperfect authentic cadence is weaker than perfect authentic. So let's see how this works when we put phrases together. We have a phrase ending in a half cadence and a second phrase that starts on 1. So after the half cadence, it goes back to starts at 1 and goes all the way around and resolves 5-1. And it could either end in an imperfect authentic cadence or perfect authentic cadence. So just you could put those 2 phrases together, 2 types of phrase together, and you would get a period. And what kind of period would that be called? We're going to end up calling it interrupted. So here's the idea. This, I think, was the origins of the whole ball analogy in the first place. So you take one ball, you throw it up, and it pauses, but you don't wait for it to come down. You interrupt that one ball's arc, and you come back down and take a different ball and throw it up and catch it. So that's the idea of interruption. So it's not going to be the case that every time the first phrase ends with a half cadence, it's going to be authentic. Or sorry, it's going to be interrupted. That's only going to be the case if the second phrase goes back and starts on 1. So let's look at a second possibility. Take the ball, you throw it up, it pauses at the moment of half cadence, but you keep the same ball and you continue that down to an authentic cadence. Right? You can see how these two phrases together versus these two phrases together are slightly different in that this phrase, the second phrase, starts away from 1, whereas this second phrase starts on 1. So we call that continuous. So this is, if the idea is like these are harmonic movements. This one starts a harmonic movement but doesn't complete it. And then you get a second harmonic movement. So that's called interrupted because the first harmonic movement is interrupted. This one starts one harmonic movement and then continues it. So that's why it's called continuous. Remember that for half cadence up here, you could also have a cadence in some other key. It doesn't have to be just a 5 chord in the original key. Okay, and now this is what happens when we have two phrases together that both end in authentic cadences, but the first one is weaker than the second, right? So an imperfect authentic cadence is weaker than a perfect authentic cadence. You have those two phrases that go together. They're both two complete harmonic movements, so you can call them two complete harmonic sections, in a sense. This one starts and ends in 1, and a second one starts and ends in 1. So that's why it's called a sectional period. Okay, these terms, interrupted doesn't really come back all that much, but continuous and sectional do come back. When we look at binary form, we're going to see those terms come back, continuous and sectional. And when we talk about variations forms, we'll also use those terms. Do you guys hear the rooster? Okay. As you know, there is, of course, one more type of period in terms of harmonic structure. You get one phrase, you get a second one. It doesn't really matter what's going to happen in here, as you'll see in a second. But at the end of the second phrase, we're going to cadence in some other key. So I needed this to put this on its own screen because it starts in one key and it ends in some other key. It doesn't matter what key this is in. Maybe it's still in the same key or whatever. But by the end of the two phrases, you're in some other key. So yeah, it doesn't matter what takes place in there. We would call this progressive. Why do we call it progressive? Because it moves from one key to the next. So you throw the ball up, and then, that's the thing is that this one could be half cadence, right? It could be imperfect authentic. It could be kind of anything. Might be in the original key, might not. Doesn't matter. But you have one thing here, and then and then the second thing. But by the time you get to the second thing, you are in a different place. So you progress there. And then, of course, the way to remember this is you do have to be careful not to accidentally hit Bernie Sanders on the head with your progressive periods. But that helps you remember that progressive means that it's by the end of the period that you are modulating. If you modulated in the middle of the period, probably be continuous. Okay, this is a chart from page 386 of Laitz. And then I've got some diagrams in here where we can practice, but this is the thing to just have this open whenever you're doing homework on this, both this year and next year. So interrupted periods, okay, sorry. This whole box refers to interrupted periods. If it's an interrupted period, it could be parallel interrupted or it could be contrasting interrupted. We'll do those melodic terms in just a moment. And actually, maybe we should just do them here, but that's going to be abbreviated PIP, parallel interrupted, and the last P is just for period. I do think it's on the next screen that I show you how to do this with melody, but I'll just point out one other thing in here. So you have a first phrase and a second phrase. What we just looked at is how to get the harmonic structure, whether it's interrupted or sectional or continuous or progressive, right? But then the difference in between, say, this diagram and this diagram, they're both interrupted, but this one has an A phrase followed by a very similar phrase, just with a different cadence. That's why it's A prime. Whereas this one has an A phrase and then just like different melodic material here. That's why it's A and B. So that's the difference between parallel and contrasting. So you get PIP versus CIP. And maybe I'll show you one more thing. This little double dash thing after the HC, that's the interruption sign. So when you're doing your diagrams, by the way, your diagrams are going to look just exactly like these things here. That's why you should keep this open. You'll put ideally put a measure number in there because I need to know where your cadences are. But aside from that, this is what your diagram should look like. And you could also write, for PIP, you could write that in here. Or CIP, you could write that in here. Okay. So I recommend, I don't know, it's stronger than recommendation. What would that be? I decree that you must write out this chart right now. So if you need to go get paper, just pause the video. There's also a chart that you should, where you write it out more than once. And then you can also do the same with the pictures on the previous page, but just practice drawing this out a bit. But this one helps you work through all the logical possibilities. So periods. The way you're going to figure out if it's a PIP or a CIP or a PCP or a PSP or a PIP, those sorts of things. You've got a melody category and a harmony category. Harmony is what we just looked at, but we looked at in the previous slides, but we'll do melody first. So you have just parallel versus contrasting. And it's what I said on the last screen, that for parallel, it's when you have two phrases that have this similar melodic content. The second one's just a little bit different because it has a different cadence. Whereas contrasting is two phrases and it's different melodic content. We'll see examples of this, so it's hard to understand without looking at or listening to music. But this is it in theory, what it means. So if you draw out your diagram and it looks like this, then the phrases are contrasting. If you draw out your diagram and it looks like this, then your phrases are parallel. Okay. And then we saw what these things mean. You have an interrupted structure, which means like you kind of take the ball up, you throw it, you pause on 5. You have the interruption sign, you take a separate ball and start again on 1, and then you resolve with an authentic cadence. And it could be perfect authentic or imperfect authentic. Okay, continuous, let's see if we can remember what it is. You take one ball, throw it up, it pauses on a half cadence, or at least somewhere other than 1, and then it continues from that non-1 place and resolves with an authentic cadence. So that's what we have here. Take a ball up, throw it up in the air, it pauses on 5, you then stay on 5 or on something like it, and then you have an authentic cadence. Okay, and just notice there's no interruption sign here. Sectional period, do we remember what this one is? It's 2 complete sections, 2 complete harmonic movements. So the first ball is going to start and end on 1, the second ball is going to start and end on 1, and the first cadence has to be weaker than the second, so the first one's an imperfect authentic, second one is perfect authentic. So the way I wrote this here, you don't have to, you would normally write in not the scale degrees. You could do that actually in your paper, that's kind of a good idea. But you would want to write IAC, imperfect authentic cadence, because I'm intending this to be the melodic pitch. So this is a phrase that starts on 1 and ends with a 5-1 cadence, but it's melodically unresolved because it has scale degree 3 in the melody, versus you take a second ball, or maybe it's the same one, but you start another harmonic section. This phrase is a separate harmonic section, and you end 5-1 melody on scale degree 1. So this is a 2 separate melodic sections, or 2 separate harmonic sections. This is 1 continuous harmonic section or harmonic movement. This is an interrupted harmonic movement or harmonic section. That's how you can think about it. And then any of these things, so you could have a parallel interrupted, parallel continuous, parallel sectional. Oh, shoot, yeah, one more. Progressive. I'll continue with that idea. You could have parallel progressive, you could have contrasting interrupted, contrasting continuous, contrasting sectional, contrasting progressive. And then there's always a P at the end of those, so it could be PIP, PCP, PSP, PPP, CIP, CCP, CSP, and CPP. Those are your possibilities. Okay, and then the last one, progressive. It doesn't matter what you do in the middle. It's just if you end up in a different key over the course of the whole period, then it's progressive. And just watch out for Bernie Sanders' head. So let's do an example. This comes from the book, example 15.2. It's by Mozart. Apparently he wrote it just for a class that was going to take place during coronavirus era. I don't know how he knew about it. And he gave it a name that he didn't want people to freak out about it, called Piano Concerto in D minor. But apparently secretly in his notes it was called the Mozart Coronavirus Concerto. So let's give it a listen. Okay, and I think the orchestra comes in here. Same idea, just repeating. So I'm going to go back here. What is going on in here? Let's see, we see this, we hear this music, we see this music, whatever. And we're trying to figure out, the first thing to ask is, where are the cadences? You know, is this all just one phrase? Is it two phrases? Is it multiple phrases? So the answer to that does come back to how many cadences are there. We know that if there's two cadences, then it's two phrases. So let's go ahead and listen again. So we're going to put a cadence here on 5. And this is imperfect authentic cadence. So the melody ends, that's scale degree 4, 3, or fa, mi. So we know that in terms of harmonic structure, what we would say is the first phrase starts on 1, ends on 5. We start again on 1 in the second phrase, and then we go 5, 1 for an imperfect authentic cadence, scale degree 3 there, 4 going to 3. So first phrase starts pauses on 5, second one starts over on 1, right, and then ends with a stronger cadence here. So maybe the first question to ask is this a period? Do we have two phrases? Yes, we do. Is the second cadence stronger than the first? The answer is imperfect authentic cadence, yes, is stronger than half cadence. So yes, it's a period. What kind of period? This first phrase gives you a partial harmonic motion, right? But it's interrupted. You start over on 1, and then you get a complete harmonic motion. So it's an interrupted period. So now all we have to ask is it A prime in terms of melodic structure, or is it A B? So the first phrase is you just pay attention to the first two bars and then start over again. It's the same. So we would call that, and it's different at the cadence, that's why we get the prime, but this is going to be A prime, so they're parallel, and then we know it's interrupted. So the answer to this one is it's a PIP, parallel interrupted period. Okay, let's try the next example. And I'll play this. If you want, just go ahead and, after I play it, pause the video, listen to it as many times as you want, see if you can figure out what the answer is. Well, I could just... repeats here. Okay, so if you'd like, go ahead and pause the video now, see if you can figure this out. You can see Laitz has actually labeled cadences for you. What we need to do is find how many cadences there are. That tells us how many phrases. I mean, obviously he has these marked, this first phrase and second phrase. He uses the terms antecedent and consequent. Those are used in lots of books. Laitz does use them in these diagrams, but and I think maybe in the first paragraph of the chapter, but he doesn't really use those terms all that much throughout the rest of the book. So definitely good to know antecedent and consequent. I don't use them all that much in class, but of course, we don't even have class all that much right now. So you learn them if you want to, antecedent and consequent. They just mean what comes before and what comes after. Antecedents and con, sequence, with sequence, sequentially? Actually, I don't know what it is. Okay, so let's just see, that's our pause. What kind of chord is it? It's an F, A, F. There's no C, but it would be 5 chord. There's just a tiny little E natural that's just a non-chord tone leading you to the F. We'll do that at the beginning of next year. It's a little tiny applied chord, or really just a non-chord tone. So we have a cadence on 5 there. First phrase starts on 1, ends on 5. Second phrase this time does not start back on 1. It stays away from 1. Da 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 dum bum da da dum da da bum ba dum. Scale degree 2, 1, and B flat, so it's perfect authentic cadence. 5, 1. Right, the 2 is coming a little bit after the beat, but that's perfectly fine. Beethoven is allowed to do that. And then, I looked here and I said that's not starting back on 1. Da 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 dum. If we try to figure out what chord that is, we can go F, A, C, E flat, and G. So, It's a dominant chord. It's even got a ninth in it. But that's definitely starting away from 1. Oops. So what we have is one phrase that starts on 1, pauses on 5. You then continue that same ball, starting on 5 and going back to 1. Is it a period? There's 2 phrases. Is the second cadence, we're going to have that second cadence here, stronger than the first cadence? The answer is yes. PAC is stronger than HC. And then all we just have to know is which type. So we have a continuous period, right? Because the first phrase starts on 1, ends on 5. Then you continue that harmonic movement back to 1. So it's continuous. And then are they parallel or contrasting? We could just look at the beginning of the phrase. Yeah, definitely different. Obviously, they both have 16th notes, but that's about 16th notes followed by motivically similar, but they're not melodically similar. And then going back to that original diagram we know we do melodic structure first, then harmonic structure. So the label for this, melody is contrasting, harmony is continuous, so it's a CCP. Shall we give this a listen? So first question asks, which is not super obvious, is how many phrases are there? If they weren't already marked here, you might be tempted to put a phrase end there because of the rest, and then again there because of the rest, and then again there. You might say it's 4 phrases. This is a reason why it's good to pay attention to harmonic structure. So I think I'll go ahead and play it again. What I would like you to pay attention to is we have a 1 chord here. This is probably a 7-6 and then 1-6. That we know is just a passing structure. 1, 7, 6, 1, 6. And then 4, 1, and then 5, 1. So it's really harmonically, it's really not even there until we don't get a cadence until there. And which kind is it? We have scale degree 4, 3, so imperfect authentic cadence. And then here we're repeating the same thing. It's just down an octave, but don't let that fool you. But then the second half of it is a little bit different, but we have a 2, 6, and then 5, 1. So again, cadence there. So you can kind of tell harmonically that these rests are not significant enough to be, the ends of phrases. Okay, so 2 phrases. Second one ends in a perfect authentic cadence. First one ends in an imperfect authentic cadence. Therefore, do they form a period? Do these 2 phrases form a period? Does the first one end with a weaker cadence? Yes, IAC is weaker than PAC. Next question, if your first phrase ends with an imperfect authentic cadence, what kind of period do you have? We have to go back to that, the diagram in our heads or the various figures. There's only one kind of period we have where the first phrase completes its own harmonic movement. It's melodically unresolved, but it's harmonically resolved, right? You throw the first ball up and it comes back and ends on 1. You just catch it somewhat imperfectly. So it's melodically unresolved, but it's its own harmonic section. And then you have the second phrase again starts on 1 and then resolves with a perfect authentic cadence. Resolves not just the harmony, but also the melody. So answer is it's a sectional period. And then we just have to say whether the melody is the same or different, right? Similar or parallel or contrasting. So like I said, this part is just down an octave from here, but otherwise it's identical. Even if this were like similar but very decorated, it still counts as the same. So we would call this parallel. Hard to sing, but right, that's the same. And the fact that the ends are different doesn't really matter. It does take a little while to get good at figuring out whether 2 phrases are parallel or contrasting, but for now you're at least like getting some exposure to that. Okay, and let's move on to one more. This is from Beethoven. So let me give you some targeted things to think about before you listen. We're going to start in D minor. We got the phrases marked. So let's just assume, yes, there's 2 phrases. We could even look right now and say, is it going to be a period? The second phrase ends in a perfect authentic perfect authentic cadence in a different key. First phrase ends in a half cadence. Is the PAC stronger than the half cadence? The answer is yes. So yes, it forms a period. So two phrases that form a period. We want to know what kind, and we want to think, of course, about both melodic structure and harmonic structure. So melodic structure, are the melodies parallel or contrasting? And harmonic structure is going to be interrupted, continuous, sectional, or progressive. And it's going to repeat here. So let's do melody first. Normally you'll probably do melody first and then harmony first. That's at least the way we write them in the abbreviation, right? Of PIP, PCP, CIP, etc. Okay, so dum, 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 dum. We just look at that. And the second phrase is yum, dum, 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 dum. So that last note is different. And this second one is transposed up relative to this one, but the whole key is changed. So, I mean, it's hard. What you'll note probably at first is like, yeah, definitely rhythmically, that's the same idea. It's definitely invoking the same thing. What you really want to do is look at scale degrees. So, and you do have to change keys to do it. I mean, this is like how you figure out if something is parallel or contrasting. So in D minor, the scale degree, I think this is my D. That can't be a D. Let's go back and listen. Okay, so scale degree 1, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then in F, scale degree 1, 5, 4, 3, 2, 3, sharp 2, 3. The 3 at the end, at the end it's a little tiny bit different, but definitely same scale degrees, 1, 5, 4, 3, right? So that is enough to tell us that yes, these are intended to be parallel. So that is our first answer. It's parallel. Now harmonic structure. First phrase ends in a half cadence. Second phrase starts somewhere other than 1, and then ends in a perfect authentic cadence, but in a different key. So what does that tell us? It's not interrupted, it's not continuous, it's not sectional, it is progressive. I thought Bernie Sanders was going to pop up. No, it's progressive because over the course of the whole period you end up in a different key. So it is parallel progressive period, P, P, P. Okay, we're going to look at a slightly more complex example. Che farò senza Eurydice. Eurydice. I don't know how to say it. I don't even know what language it is. I think it's Italian. And this is a good piece. It's from Gluck's Orfeo. You probably know the story, but Orpheus has a girlfriend. Her name's Eurydice. He's probably married to her. And she gets bitten by a snake. He's disappointed. He is a very good musician. He is able to charm rocks and trees. So he decides that why not go down into the underworld and try to charm, I think it's Persephone and Pluto, maybe, and ask them to give him Eurydice back. So then they say, they too are charmed by the rock and tree charmer of Orfeo, and they say, okay, you can have her back, but just you're not allowed to look back at her as you guys are walking back up to, the normal part of the world. And then different versions do it differently. This is the story of one of the very earliest operas that there was by Giacomo Peri, and maybe also Caccini. At least in some of the early versions, they just make it so like, oh, they're happy and they get married and live ever after, or they get to go to their wedding and live ever after. I guess they were fiancés. But in the version by Gluck, Eurydice is like arguing with Orfeo. And she's like, why won't you look at me? And he says, look, I can't. But then he gets so frustrated that he looks back at her and, he doesn't intend to. And then she gets sucked back into the underworld again. And then this time, his pain is twice as bad because this time it's actually his fault that she's dead. Okay, let's give it a listen. Che farò senza Eurydice, dove andrò senza il mio ben? Where am I without my Eurydice? What am I, or where will I go without my little beloved? I think that's rough translation. As you're listening, you can pay attention to where the cadences are and which kinds of cadences they are. And there's an introduction here. I'll tell you, well, you'll figure out when the words start. Okay, here's where it starts. So that's just the beginning of the tune. It's actually in a rondo form, which you learn about next year, but it's this, and then it goes off to a different contrasting section where he has some like painful thoughts. I don't know, I hope you also notice this is an interesting piece in the history of music because it doesn't really sound all that sad. It sort of sounds like someone said at some point that you could just change the words to I've found my Eurydice instead of I've lost my Eurydice. Okay, but that's for another day. The middle sections, the contrasting middle sections are pretty dramatic, and then it comes back to this, which is sort of placid or even stoic. So I'm going to play it for you again, and we'll put in the Roman numerals. You got the intro again. So what I have here is just the melody written out. Nah, man, I kind of wish the stuff wasn't here, but just ignore that. Ignore the little coda sign in the third time. I got this from, I had written out the whole piece in some project I was working on. So, okay, not important. I copied those chords here. We can look at the melody, and let's give, we probably don't need it, but let's give it one more listen. Just the melody. Half cadence. Imperfect authentic cadence. Little tiny half cadence. This is more substantial. Okay, so I have, there are like interpretations where you might say that everything that's possibly a cadence is a cadence. You might have some where you'd say, oh, it has to feel substantial to be a full phrase. I've marked the little half cadences here as at least cadences. They're pauses on 5. Not super significant whether we want to say they are or not. Let's look individually at each of these little sections. So we have, in this first part, If we were to combine those two, we would have a phrase that ends on a half cadence and a phrase that ends on an imperfect authentic cadence. Is that a period? Is this cadence stronger than this one? Right? It's not because this one's weak, but just because imperfect authentic cadence is stronger than half cadence. So the answer is yes. We could figure out what kind that would be. We could look here. We have a little thing ending on a half cadence, a little thing ending on another half cadence. If you had two phrases that went together as half cadence and half cadence, would that be a period? The answer is no, because the second cadence is not stronger than the first one. And then you have these phrases. Ending on scale degree 3, and then repeat of the same phrase. Dove andro senza il mio ben, ending on 1. So there you have two phrases that go together, weaker cadence and stronger cadence, so we could ask what kind of period that would form. Okay, so I think we get to listen to this as we go. And if we were to go back, I think I might just go back a couple screens. And okay, so for this screen, like we said, first phrase ends with a half cadence, second phrase ends with an imperfect authentic cadence. Yes, it forms a period. What kind would it be? We rest on 5, but we go back to 1 here. We can tell by the Roman numerals. And are these phrases parallel or contrasting? They're contrasting. Scale degree 3, 4, 5, and then 5, 1, 5, 6. Right? So those are contrasting, definitely. So they're contrasting, and then end on 5, return to 1. It's a 1/6, so that makes it a lot weaker. I think it's up in the air whether we would say this would be continuous or interrupted. And it depends on whether you said the 1/6 feels like it's away from 1. It's also like on an offbeat. It's very weak. So if you want to say the phrase really starts here on 4, then you'd say it's continuous. Otherwise, you'd say it's an interrupted structure. Okay? And then so it would be contrasting continuous, CCP, or contrasting interrupted, CIP. This one, not a period. Two phrases, they both end with half cadences. The second one's not any stronger than the next. And then we look at the last two phrases. First one ends with a weaker cadence than the second one, so yes, they do form a period. The first one ends with an imperfect authentic cadence, so therefore it's sectional. And we just have to say whether they're parallel or contrasting, and the melodies are the same. They're the same except pretty much like the last two notes. La-dum versus da-dum. So yeah, parallel. So parallel sectional period, PSP. Okay. And then maybe we listen one more time and we could just look at what the large scale second level analysis would be. I have like this stuff written in, but we ended up putting these two guys together, right? This is all just like one melody in a sense. Like when you listen to it, you didn't think, it's a whole bunch of different melodies. But it does have a couple of different phrase models in it. So even periods, like we would say these two guys form a period. These don't form a period, but these two form a period. And you could lump these in with this or not. I mean, that's sort of up to you. So at least we have two periods. We're going to have at the first level, or at a smaller level, we have this second level structure. And just at the next level, it might look like this. So just ignoring that cadence, saying that ends with imperfect authentic cadence. This is all just tonic. We're ignoring this BRD, the back relating dominant. Then that phrase, and then a repeat. So like I said, this is a more complex example. How many phrase models do we have? We have one here. Well, I don't know if we count that or what, but if we did count it, there's an interruption there. And then phrase model. So 3 different phrase models, maybe a fourth, but probably not. Okay, let's look at the definition of period. Period in music doesn't really mean anything like it does in language. I mean, maybe. If you assume that a sentence has to have a subject and a predicate, you can think of a period as having to have a first phrase and a second phrase. And you could also say that they go together if you just say the subject of a sentence and then you pause. Even if you just say the subject of a sentence, right, that's grammatically incomplete. You have to complete it with the second thing. If I said the big fancy chicken in Dr. Bashwinner's backyard, if I just say it like that, right, that's the subject of a sentence, and it implies that it's needs a predicate like keeps escaping and is therefore a bad chicken, right? Second phrase completes the first phrase. The consequent completes the antecedent. So, by definition, a period in music is two phrases that go together. That's really how we can define period. It's important for us to take a second step, say, why did they go together? But that doesn't change the definition. We're just saying, but how do we know what makes them go together? And the answer is, so I guess this is part of the definition too, because the cadence at the end of the first phrase is weaker than the cadence at the end of the second phrase. Just like with the big fancy chicken that's in Dr. Bashwinner's backyard, that's kind of a weak cadence at the end of the subject of that sentence. Is a bad chicken, keeps escaping and therefore is a bad chicken, period. Or end of sentence, right? So that second cadence is stronger. The first phrase, first part of it has to be weaker in order to require an ending in the second part. That's the idea. So let's just do a little practice here. I have these general diagrams. There's no music involved. We just get to look at them, see if you can figure out in the structure. Why don't you pause the video right now and see if you can answer these questions. I hope you're pausing. If you're not pausing, now would be the time to pause. Unless you already paused and now you're back. Okay, welcome back. First phrase, A. Second phrase, A prime. Therefore, they're parallel. Oh, but let's do cadences first. We could do... Anyway, let's do cadences. So at the end of the first phrase is a 5 chord and then an interruption sign, and then we start again on 1. So therefore, that means the first cadence is half cadence, and second phrase is perfect authentic cadence. Since it's A and A prime, they're parallel, and we have an interrupted structure here if the first phrase ends with a half cadence and then starts again on 1. So therefore, it's PIP. Did you get it right? Okay, here's number 2. I'm pausing for you guys to be pausing. Okay, and welcome back. So the two phrases, A and B, so therefore it's going to be contrasting. The first phrase ends with half cadence, but then it continues on 5, right? And then it ends with a perfect authentic cadence at the end. So it's contrasting, and in this case it's continuous. First phrase ends on a half cadence, but then continues. The second phrase starts away from 1. So we have contrasting, continuous, period. Remember, always melody first. C for contrasting, and then C for continuous, which is harmony. P for period. Pause. Hi, and welcome back. Two phrases, A and B, therefore, contrasting. First cadence ends 5-1, but with scale degrees 4 going to 3 in the melody, so imperfect authentic cadence. Second cadence, scale degrees, or chords 5 going to 1, but scale degrees 2 going to 1 in the melody, so perfect authentic cadence. So we have A and B for melody, so it's contrasting. And then we have the first phrase ending on imperfect authentic cadence, so its own complete harmonic section. It's just not complete melodically, so it is a contrasting sectional period. If you want to pause, again, now is the time. Okay. Hi, and welcome back. A and A prime for melody, so it's going to be a P there. They're parallel. At the end of the first phrase, harmonically, we have a cadence. This time we're in minor. Ooh, but it's the same thing, so it's an imperfect authentic cadence, right? It's ending scale degrees 4 going to 3. And then second phrase, interestingly, ends in a different key. Oh yeah, that's written weird. That bracket should be above the 3, and you'll learn about that next semester. But if we look, that box is already filled in for cadence type. It's a perfect authentic cadence in 3. So when you learn how to modulate, And when you learn how to do tonicizations, you'll understand what the bracket means, even though the bracket is supposed to be right there. But just assume for right now this is a perfect authentic cadence in a different key. Perfect authentic cadence in I. In 3. So over the course of the whole period, we modulate, right? That tells you something. So it's parallel, A and A prime, and then the whole thing modulates, so it's a PPP, parallel progressive period. Oh, watch out, Bernie. I think this is our last one. We have an A and a B, so it's going to be contrasting. At the end of the first phrase, we do a cadence, an authentic cadence of whatever sort, really cadence just of any sort, in a different key. That's the most important part. And then the second phrase, we start again somewhere other than 1. So this is going to be continuous. It's what you can imagine is this is just like if we were in 5. It's just somewhere away from 1. So first phrase starts in 1, pauses somewhere away from 1, someplace where the tension is still high. It starts again someplace where the tension is still high, and then it resolves 5-1 at the end, and it resolves scale degree 2-1. So this first cadence is just what it already had in the box, A, C, in, I. Authentic cadence in 2. Again, you'll learn about that next year. And then this one's a perfect authentic cadence in 1, of course. So is this one progressive? The answer is no, not progressive, because by the end of the whole period, we have not modulated, right? We just have a little modulation in here. This is just like ending on a 5 chord. It's just ending somewhere away from 1, continuing back to 1. So these phrases are contrasting, A and B. So it is a C and C for contrasting, and then this is continuous in here. So CCP. Okay, that's it. What goes up must come down. I hope you enjoyed learning about period structure. Maybe you even learned some other fancy things.
Goes up, must come down.
I hope your end of the semester is treating you well.